Come closer now. Let the world outside your window fade to a soft, distant hum. I am the whisperer, and I am here to usher you toward the gentle dark. I know you have sought this video to find your rest, so allow my voice to be a soft blanket for your thoughts. Before we begin, a small kindness, a like, a subscription. Tell me, where in the world are you, and what hour of the night has found you? Now, settle in. Let your body grow heavy, your breath slow. There is nothing to do but listen. Sleep had unstitched itself from my nights. 3 weeks it had been, a slow, quiet unraveling, leaving behind only the ghost of exhaustion, a profound weariness that ached in my bones but would not grant the mercy of oblivion. The small room, my studio, seemed to breathe with me, shrinking with every shallow inhale. Its 2 windows faced one another, twin pools of silent, black glass. When the lonely streetlights bled through, they would catch each other's gaze, creating a corridor of faint, unending reflections, a hallway of ghosts stretching into forever. What I had yet to learn was that some reflections do not need the light to stir. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a waking dream, a simple phantom born of sleeplessness. The clock on the wall had painted the hour, 3:17 in the morning. I was standing in the hollow center of my room, my gaze fixed on the eastern window, the one that looked out over the sleeping alleyway. My reflection was there, of course. A pale man, his form softened by the night, his t-shirt a landscape of wrinkles, but a subtle discord hummed in the air, a wrongness in the geometry. The shape in the glass held its shoulders at a different slant, its head tilted with a weariness that was deeper, older than my own. A desert dryness coated my tongue. I lifted my right hand, a slow, deliberate test. The reflection, in turn, lifted its left, a perfect, silent echo. Normal. My own shoulders eased, a small release of tension, and it was in that moment of relief that I saw it. The other arm, the reflection's arm. It was reaching, not toward me, but toward the curtain on the western window, the window that stood behind me, unseen. My own arms were leaden things, hanging still at my sides, but in the glass, a hand I could not feel was taking hold of the heavy fabric. Then came the sound, a soft, whispering slide of cloth across the metal rod. It was not a sound in my head. It was a sound in the room, real as my own ragged breathing. My heart became a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I spun around. The western curtain was drawn shut, a shroud of velvet pulled taut across the pane. I had left it open. I always left it open. A silent invitation for the morning sun. A cold sweat bloomed on my skin as I turned back to the eastern window. The reflection was there, innocent and still, a perfect copy of my own confusion, my own trembling. When my eyes blinked, its eyes blinked. We were one again. But the curtain behind me remained closed. The rest of that night was spent in a chair, a sentinel positioned in the space between the 2 glass eyes of the room. Nothing else stirred. By the time the gray dawn arrived, I had woven a story of logic to soothe myself. It was stress, I reasoned. The coffee, the sleeplessness. A draft from the old vent must have teased the curtain shut. The reflection, a simple trick of a tired mind, of light and shadow playing their games. I opened the western curtain and let the day erase the night. The second visitation came 5 nights later. I had begun a new ritual, a small act of control. Before surrendering to my bed, I would arrange the curtains just so. The eastern one open, the western one drawn 3/4 of the way, a specific, measured gap. I would even capture the image with the camera on my phone, a brittle photograph to hold reality in place. At 2:43 a.m., I was pulled from a shallow, restless state by a sound that did not belong. The low, mournful groan of wood scraping against the floorboards. My bedside lamp, another new precaution, cast a soft, honeyed glow across the room, leaving no place for shadows to hide. My small dining table, once tucked neatly against the wall, had been dragged 2 feet closer to the western window. The 2 chairs, which always sat beneath it, now stood on either side, angled away from the table like silent guardians at their post. A slow, heavy thunder began to beat in my ears. I sat up, my gaze sweeping the apartment. The door was still locked, the chain still in its cradle. The windows were sealed. No one could have entered. My eyes fell upon the eastern window, and the air in my lungs turned to ice. My reflection was there, but it was not mirroring me. While I was here, tangled in the sheets of my bed, my reflection was sitting in one of the displaced chairs. Its hands were folded calmly on the surface of the table. It was watching me, and it was waiting. The logical part of my mind screamed silent, rational words. Hallucination. A breakdown. The air is poisoned. But my body knew a deeper truth. It answered only to the chilling stillness of what it saw. A cold fire of adrenaline coursed through me. My hands shook with a life of their own. I pushed myself out of bed, forcing my legs to carry me toward the eastern window. With every step I took, the reflection rose from its chair and moved to meet me. By the time my fingers touched the cold surface of the glass, we were in perfect, terrible synchronicity once more. But the furniture, the chairs, and the table remained in their new, uncanny arrangement. It took me 20 minutes to return them to their proper places, my hands checking and rechecking their positions against the small, glowing photograph on my phone. The room looked normal again. My reflection behaved as it should. But sleep was a shore I would never reach again. The quiet visitations grew more frequent, more intimate. Over the next week, the haunting became a silent, collaborative rearranging of my world. Books would appear on different shelves, their spines facing outward as if patiently read, while my reflection turned invisible pages. The doors of the kitchen cabinets would be left open, while the man in the glass seemed to prepare a meal I would never taste. I would hear the soft rush of water from the bathroom and find the faucet running, while my reflection went through the motions of brushing teeth that were not mine. Each time, I would turn from the eastern window to find these small changes made real in my apartment. And each time, the moment I looked back, the reflection would become my perfect, silent twin once more. My hunger left me. The world took on the taste of dust. Dark, bruised hollows bloomed beneath my eyes. At work, my colleagues would ask if I was unwell, their voices sounding faint and far away, as if traveling through water. I would tell them I was fine, just tired. But their worried faces told me my own was becoming a mask of quiet horror. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, a night like any other. I had filled the room with small, unblinking eyes, motion-activated cameras in every corner, their silent vigil displayed on the screen of my laptop. I would have proof. I would capture the ghost. At 1:33 in the morning, I sat on my bed, my gaze fixed on the glowing screen, and I watched. I watched as my reflection began to move the furniture. But that was not the part that broke me. On the screen, I could see two of me. The real me, the one I knew to be sitting still on the edge of the bed, was also there. Two identical forms, one in the glass and one in the room, working in a silent, coordinated ballet. They were rearranging my world into a strange and intricate labyrinth. The table was used to block a path. The chairs became a barrier. The bookshelf was angled to cut off the way to the door. And yet, I sat on my bed, a statue of flesh and bone, feeling nothing. My body was still. But there, on the screen, it moved with a purpose I did not understand. My chest tightened, a band of ice squeezing the air from my lungs. The room began to swim, the glowing screen a portal into a reality that had split in two. Were the cameras weaving a lie, or had my own mind finally torn apart? I forced my gaze away from the laptop toward the eastern window. My reflection was there, but it was no longer pressed against the glass. It was standing deep within the reflected room, in the center of the maze it had built. And it was gesturing, slow, deliberate motions of its hands, pointing at a chair, then at a space on the floor. It was showing me something. It was teaching me. With a dawning, soul-deep horror, I understood. It was showing me how to solve the puzzle. It was demonstrating the exact sequence of movements required to put the room back. This chair, lifted and placed here. That table, slid just so. I had to perform these actions in this precise order to undo what had been done. This thing in the glass, this other me, it lived somewhere ahead of me. It was performing actions I had not yet taken, showing me the steps I was about to make. It was my future, or something wearing my future like a coat, reaching back to rearrange my present. I remained frozen, a prisoner on my own bed. I was afraid to move, afraid to begin the sequence it showed me. What would happen when I was finished? What would it show me then? How far ahead could it see? Its silent demonstration continued, a patient, repeating loop. Move the chair here. Slide the table there. The gestures became more insistent, tinged with a strange urgency, as if some unseen clock was ticking down. The furniture blocked my path to the door. The windows were locked, a 3-story drop to the silent street below. I was caught in its game, and the only way out was to play. My breathing was a shallow, panicked flutter. The walls seemed to draw closer, the furniture a cage of my own making. Every part of me screamed to run, but there was no world to run to. Then the demonstration stopped. The reflection lowered its hand and pointed, not at its own chest in the glass. It pointed directly at me, the real me, sitting on the bed. It could see me. It had always been able to see me. And now it was walking toward the glass, not from my side, but from within the reflection. It grew larger, its form sharpening as it approached the fragile barrier between our worlds. Its face, which was my face, wore an expression I had never known. It was a look of ancient, predatory patience, mixed with a quiet, unnerving hunger. I had been thinking of it all wrong. It wasn't showing me the future. It was the future, reaching back through the glass to move the pieces of the past. I was not watching what I would do. I was watching what I'd already done, from a place where it hadn't happened yet. In this room, time was not a straight line. Past and future were coiled together, their images bouncing endlessly between the two dark eyes of the windows. And something had learned how to walk that shimmering, impossible path. It pressed its palms flat against the inside of the glass. It leaned in so close that I should have seen its breath fog the pain. Instead, a wave of impossible warmth washed over my own face. "You understand now," it said. The words did not come from its lips. They blossomed inside my mind, spoken in the familiar cadence of my own inner voice. You have always understood. You are the one who has been moving the furniture. Every night, trying to create the pattern, trying to get back to the beginning. The cameras had been telling the truth. The realization was not a thought, but a physical blow. I had been moving in my sleep or in some waking trance I could not recall. My reflection was not some separate being. It was me. A part of me acting beyond my own awareness, in the liminal spaces between dream and waking. But this brought no comfort, only a deeper, more chilling fear. Because if that was me, then what was this thing? This thing that wore my face and stared at me with hungry, lightless eyes? I stood, my legs trembling but holding me. The thing in the window, my other self, offered a slow, knowing smile. It stepped back from the glass and gestured once more to the puzzle of the room. The choice was a silent one. I could complete the sequence and see what lay at the end of the path, or I could remain here, in this fractured moment, forever, caught between what I had done, what I was doing, and what I would do. My hands began to move, not by my own will, but as if pulled by invisible strings. They reached for the nearest chair. As I lifted it, my reflection nodded, a gesture of approval, and began to show me the next step. One by one, I moved each piece of furniture, following the silent choreography. With each movement, a strange familiarity settled over me. It felt less like I was creating a new arrangement, and more like I was restoring an old one. The pattern was not in my mind, but in my muscles, a forgotten memory held in the fibers of my own body. When I placed the final piece, the small end table just beside the western window, something in the room shifted. The air grew heavy, still, charged with a silent, waiting energy. The curtains on both windows began to move, not with a breeze, but with a life of their own, sliding open to reveal the full, dark expanse of glass. My reflection in the eastern window was gone. But when I looked to the western window, I saw it there, standing behind me. No, not behind me. It was standing where I'd been standing just moments before. It was showing me my past. The room was no longer fixed in time. All moments were here, now, past, present, future. A deck of cards collapsed into a single shimmering instant. Every action I had ever taken or would ever take playing out in the infinite corridor between the two windows. I finally understood the purpose of the puzzle. By moving the furniture, I had tuned the room, creating a perfect temporal resonance between the two surfaces of glass. Past and future were aligned. I was standing in the very heart of the echo. My reflection, all of my reflections, stretching into infinity in both directions, turned their heads to look at me. Their faces held a deep and unnerving satisfaction. They had been waiting for me to understand, to take my place in the pattern. I was the lock and the key, the watcher and the watched, the student learning the sequence and the teacher demonstrating it. I walked to the absolute center of the room, the focal point between the two windows, and I saw myself with a terrible clarity. An endless line of me extending in both directions. Each one a slightly different version, a different moment in the loop I had built. The terror had faded, replaced by something else. It was not peace. It was a vast, quiet, resigned understanding. I was trapped, yes, but I was also free. Free to exist in all moments at once, unbound from the slow, cruel march of time. My reflection smiled, and it began to rearrange the furniture once more, preparing the room, preparing the puzzle for the next soul who would come to live in this place, for the next person who would stand between these two dark windows and wonder why their reflection seemed so very wrong. The pattern must continue. It has to. Story 2. The stone beneath my shoes was wrong. It held a warmth that did not belong to the deep chill of November, a gentle heat like that of a sleeping body. I should have retreated then, the moment my foot met the entrance to Evangeline Bridge. I should have heeded the quiet twisting in my stomach, a feeling like swallowing a knot of cold glass. But the burn of whiskey and the phantom weight of a returned engagement ring had blurred the edges of the world, leaving me adrift in the night, seeking the simple solace of a walk home. The bridge unspooled before me, a long, pale bone in the throat of the darkness. Its arches were like hollowed eyes, drinking the soft, anemic light of the street lamps. 1,000 times I had crossed it in my 5 years here, but never so late. Never when the fog drifted in from the harbor, a great, silent beast wrapping the world in a milky shroud. My footsteps made no sound tonight, not the familiar, sharp report of a leather on stone, but something else entirely, something softer, a sigh. With each step I took, the bridge did not echo, but exhaled, a slow, feminine breath that seemed to rise from the very marble beneath me. I froze, and the bird in my chest beat its wings against the cage of my bones. The sound lingered, a wisp of breath curling around my legs like a current of cold water. I lifted my foot, and there was only silence. I set it down, and there it was again. Another sigh. This one fragile and filled with a deep, ancient weariness. The part of my mind that built things, the part that understood stress loads and tolerances, began to whisper explanations. Wind whistling through the ironwork, an acoustic anomaly born of the fog, the whiskey painting ghosts on the canvas of my senses. But the older part of me, the soft animal that lives beneath the bone, knew better. It knew that the world had tilted on its axis, and that I was sliding into the quiet space it had opened. I reached for my phone, a prayer for the familiar cold light of its screen. It remained a black mirror, inert and unknowing. The battery had been more than half full when I left the warmth of Murphy's bar. Now, there was nothing. Even my old watch, a thing of gears and springs, was still. Its hands were frozen, 2 slender fingers pointing to 11:47. Behind me, the city was vanishing, not fading with distance, but being gently erased, as if a great, unseen hand were turning down the volume of the world. The low hum of Harbor Street, the distant rumble of the last train, the white noise of 1,000,000 sleeping lives. It was all flowing away, drawn into the stone at my feet. The marble seemed to hum, to thrum with each sound it drank, until all that was left was the ragged whisper of my own breathing. And the sighs. They came with every footstep now, each one a different texture, a different sorrow. Some were shallow, trembling, like a breath caught in a throat. Others were long and deep, heavy with a grief that had settled into the marrow. And the most unsettling were the ones that were barely there at all, delicate as frost, like the last wisp of life leaving a body. My pace had changed without my consent. My feet had slowed, each step becoming a deliberate, thoughtful placement, as if the bridge were teaching me a new and somber dance. When I tried to hurry, to find the confident stride that had carried me across this very place so many times before, a pressure bloomed in the air. It was not a physical thing, no hand upon my shoulder, but a thickening of the wrongness, a silent gathering weight in my chest. The fog grew dense, a soft gray wall that contracted my world to a few feet of pale stone. The lamps that lined the walkway were dimming, their light drowning in the encroaching mist. I could no longer see the far shore, nor the city I had just left behind. There was only this circle of marble and fog, and the sound of breathing that was not my own. It was then that I saw the cracks. They were like fine hairs at first, dark veins spidering out from where my foot rested on the stone. They bloomed and vanished in the space of a heartbeat, so faint I thought they were a trick of the tired light. But I watched, and the pattern became a quiet, terrible truth. Each time a sigh came that was not in rhythm with my own steps, each time I resisted the slow cadence the bridge was demanding of me, these tiny fissures would bloom in the ancient marble. My mouth was a desert of dust. A cold sweat bloomed on my skin, and my hands began to tremble. My engineering mind screamed at the impossibility. Marble does not fracture from a footstep. It does not respond to a man's gait. But the other mind, the old, dark, reptilian mind that knows of things that wait in the shadows, whispered a single, clear command: obey. And so I began to walk in time with the sighs. Step, exhale. Step, exhale. The rhythm was a lullaby, slow and hypnotic. My own heart began to slow, to match its cadence. My own breath deepened into the same measured pattern. The fog seemed to consent, thinning just enough to reveal more of the path ahead. But this approval was not a comfort. It was the growing, chilling certainty that my feet were no longer my own. As I walked, slivers of memory drifted up from the deep. Stories I had heard in passing, ghosts of local lore. Evangeline Bridge, built in 1887. A monument from a tycoon, Harrison Blackwood, to a daughter lost. The girl, Evangeline, was only 19 when she had fallen from the old wooden bridge that once stood here. Some said it was a broken heart. Others whispered of a secret shame, a child that would have ruined a powerful name, a lover who vanished, a father's unforgiving rage. The new bridge, Blackwood's penance, was made of marble from Vermont, a stone as white and pure as forgiveness. But even in the brightest daylight, the bridge had never felt pure. It felt attentive. It watched the endless river of people with a quiet, hungry patience. The sighs were a chorus now. They came not only with my steps, but between them, overlapping, harmonizing into a choir of sorrow. Some were whispers, some were deep vibrations that hummed up through the soles of my shoes and into the hollows of my bones. And I realized, with a slow, creeping dread that felt like ice water in my veins, that they were not just sounds. They were shaping themselves into something. They were trying to say a word, my name. The knowing was not a thought, but a physical impact. There, in the space between the soft exhalations, I could feel the shape of the syllables that had been mine since birth. Not a clear sound, never quite clear enough to be certain, but the maddening echo of it, the ghost of a word on the tip of the tongue. The bridge knew me, but that was a door that should never have been opened. I had told no one the real reason I was walking this way, at this hour. I had never spoken of the truth behind the fight with Sarah, that it was about more than china patterns and a future that had dissolved like sugar in rain. I had never confessed the shame that had sent me into the arms of Murphy's bar, the image of her with him, the weight of the ring she had thrown back at me, her words still hot cinders in my mind. The bridge could not know the acid of that humiliation. It could not know the part of me that wanted to simply dissolve into the fog, to become a secret kept by the night. It could not know that I had walked onto it tonight, half hoping for something like this, for some grand, terrible mystery to eclipse the small, sharp pain of my own life. But as the sighs continued to form the ghost of my name, I knew. The bridge knew everything. Every secret corner of my heart, every quiet failure, every time I had stood on a metaphorical edge and wondered what it would feel like to let go. The stone was warmer now, a feverish heat against the soles of my shoes. Little wisps of steam began to rise where my feet touched down, coiling up to join the fog. The cracks were more persistent, spreading from my feet like patterns of frozen lightning. When I dared to look back, I saw my path etched into the marble, a latticework of fractures, as if my sorrow were heavy enough to break a thing that had stood for a century. I tried to run. The instant I broke the rhythm, the instant my foot lifted for a stride that was not part of the dance, the sighs became a scream. It was not a sound that entered my ears, but something far worse. A silent shriek that vibrated in my skull, a pure, distilled terror that bypassed all logic and went straight for the heart. The cracks in the stone yawned open, becoming deep, glowing fissures of pale internal light. I stumbled, and in that moment of falling, I found the rhythm again. My body surrendering before my mind could protest. The silent screaming stopped. The cracks folded back into themselves, but the fog pressed in, thick and suffocating, and I could feel a vast and ancient attention turn back to me, its interest renewed. And then I understood. The true horror. This wasn't a ghost story. The bridge wasn't haunted by Evangeline Blackwood or any other lost soul. It was the lost soul. It was a structure that had, over a century and a half, absorbed more than the city's noise. It had absorbed feeling. It had drunk the psychic weight of every person who had ever crossed it, with a heart full of stones. How many others had walked this path in the deepest chambers of their despair? How many had stood where I now stood, gazing into the black water, and felt the same terrible, gentle pull? The bridge was a monument to a final, desperate act. It had been born of grief, built over a wound in the world. For generations, it had been drinking sorrow, feeding on despair, growing stronger with every broken spirit that crossed its span. And now, it was thirsty for mine. The sighs had become my heartbeat. The rhythm was no longer something I followed. It was something I was. My legs carried me forward, not by my will, but by the will of the stone. I was being drawn to the center of the bridge, where the fog was a blindfold, and the marble pulsed with a soft, living light. A part of me wanted to fight, to tear myself from this slow, hypnotic pilgrimage and scream my way back to the real world. But a much larger, quieter part whispered that this was right, that this was where I was always meant to be, that my steps had been leading me to this exact moment long before Sarah, long before the ring, long before I had ever set eyes on this city. The heat was climbing, the marble now hot enough that I could feel it through the leather of my shoes. Each step sent up curls of steam that wrapped around my ankles like loving hands. The sighs had become one constant whisper, a conversation in a language made of loneliness and loss. It spoke of love that had turned to poison, of dreams that had crumbled to dust. It spoke of the quiet that waits at the bottom of the river, the perfect, final peace that comes after the last breath is let go. But it spoke of something else, too, a choice. As I reached the heart of the bridge, the fog parted. Not everywhere, but in a perfect circle around me, revealing the ornate iron railing that stood between the walkway and the long, dark fall. The iron was shaped into roses with thorns of rust, vines that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim, pulsing light. At the foot of each post, set into the glowing marble, were small, dark plaques, names and dates, memorials to the others, the ones who were not offered a choice. But I was. The sighing had become a single, sustained note. It rose from the stone, up through my body, making me vibrate like a struck tuning fork. It was the sound of an open door, an invitation, an opportunity that would only last for a few more heartbeats. I could feel the bridge's hunger, its deep, hollow need for the kind of nourishment that only comes from a soul's complete surrender. But I could also feel its ageless patience. It would not force the choice. It would wait for the perfect moment, when despair had ripened into acceptance, when the decision felt not like a push, but like a gentle, inevitable letting go. The marble glowed beneath me. Veins of soft fire spread out from where I stood, a circulatory system of light. The heat was searing now. My shoes had begun to smoke. I knew I had only moments before the stone would burn through leather, through skin, through bone. But in those moments, something inside me stirred. Perhaps it was the engineer, the part of me that knew this was impossible, that calculated the heat and the stress and refused to accept the data. Perhaps it was just pride, the stubborn, foolish thing that had carried me through the wreckage of my life thus far. Or perhaps it was something simpler, the instinct to breathe, to continue, to take another step, even when the world itself was telling you to stop. I took a step, backward. The bridge screamed. A real sound this time, a high, thin keen that tore out of every surface at once. The marble ruptured beneath my feet, deep wounds gaping open. The fog around me boiled, a churning, violent storm. The whispers became 1,000 voices, a cacophony speaking directly to the rawest parts of me, whispering Sarah's name, whispering of broken trust and poisoned love. But I took another step backward. The heat began to recede. The light in the stone began to fade. The voices grew distant, thin, as if being pulled away on a great, invisible tide. With each step I took back toward the city, the bridge's hold on me grew weaker. The fog began to thin, and slowly, like the first tentative notes of a distant orchestra, the sounds of the city began to bleed back into the silence. When I finally reached the entrance, I turned and looked back. The fog had almost completely dissipated. Evangeline Bridge stood as it always had, its Gothic arches and elegant stone shimmering under the normal, steady light of the lamps. There were no cracks in the marble. There was no glow, no sign of the waking dream from which I had just escaped. But as I turned and walked away, back toward the living noise and the bright, messy world of Harbor Street, I could still hear them. They were faint now, as soft as the memory of a breath. The sighs were still there, woven into the sound of the wind, a secret melody hiding in the noise of the world. They would always be there, waiting for the next heart to break. waiting for the next soul to find itself walking in the dead of night, when the fog rolls in from the harbor. I have never set foot on Evangeline Bridge again. But sometimes, when the night is very still and the wind is just so, I can hear those sighs drift across the water, and they remind me that some places are not made only of stone and steel. Some places are made of memory and pain. They connect us to the quiet, dark spaces within ourselves, where our sorrows live and feed and grow patient. The bridge is still there, beautiful, photographed, carrying the living from one side to the other. But I know what sleeps beneath its pale skin. I know what waits in the fog and in the silence between the beats of a human heart. And I know that someday, when the weight of the world grows too heavy for another to bear, they will find themselves walking that same path at the wrong hour, following a rhythm they do not understand, toward a choice they never thought they would have to make. The bridge is patient. It can wait. It has all the time in the world. Story 3. The first thing you will come to understand about the impossible rain is its silence. It is a quiet that breathes. That night, a climb had drawn me upward to the sleeping crown of Valparaiso's oldest hills. I was following the whispers on the wind, the gentle murmurs of what the Weather Service had called a minor atmospheric anomaly. As a man who watches the sky for a living, I have seen the tantrums of the air, the strange moods of the clouds, but nothing had prepared me for the stillness that gathered at precisely 11:47 p.m. Nothing could have prepared me for the storm that would unwrite the world and fold the delicate paper of my mind into a shape of quiet, unending dread. The clouds did not gather. They stitched themselves together with a needle of impossible purpose. They formed soft, geometric webs that made the eyes ache, as if looking at a map of a place one was never meant to find. Below, silent lightning pulsed without the memory of thunder, bathing the colonial houses in a slow silver heartbeat. And then the rain began. My world did not tilt. It simply dissolved. The first drop did not fall. It alighted upon my open palm with a sound like a single crystal bell struck once in a silent world. Not the familiar soft caress of water, but the cold, precise touch of something beautifully broken. I drew my hand back, not in shock, but in a slow, dreamlike curiosity. There was no blood. There was only a perfect sliver of transparency, no larger than a child's tear, impossibly sharp, impossibly clear, and from within its miniature heart, a face regarded me. It was my own, and yet a stranger's. A reflection, yes, but this reflection was alive. Its eyes, my eyes, fluttered with a life entirely their own, a quiet, rhythmic pulse of light, 3 brief eclipses of the pupil, then 3 long, lingering gazes, and 3 brief ones once more. A silent message tapped out on an anvil of light. SOS. And the mouth, a miniature wound in that tiny face, opened and closed, forming a scream that made no sound, a sound I could feel in my teeth. A soft, frantic drumming began inside my chest, the flutter of a trapped bird. More drops were descending around me now, each one touching the sleeping stones of the lane with that same delicate chime. 100 glass tears scattered across the narrow street, and in the heart of every single one, my own reflection blinked its quiet, desperate prayer. The pattern shifted, sometimes a long, sorrowful pulse followed by a short one, sometimes a rapid, breathless rhythm, but always always breathing with the exhausted panic of one who is sinking, slowly, into a silent sea. The part of my mind that loved science, the part that found comfort in charts and laws, began to whisper its own soft lullabies of reason. Hallucinations, it sang, brought on by the thin air, by the long day's end. An optical poetry, written by the pressure in the sky. A hysteria of one, though I was quite alone on this wind-kissed peak, with only the slumbering city breathing below me, a quilt of fading starlight. But reason is a fragile thing, and it began to crumble like old paper as the storm deepened its descent. The glass rain fell with a heavier whisper now, laying a carpet of glittering sorrows upon the street, a minefield of my own face, repeated into infinity. Each shard was a tiny lantern, catching the faint city glow and weaving it into Morse code, into pleas that grew more intricate, more insistent. I knelt, my knees trembling, a tremor born not of the mountain cold but of a deeper chill, a primordial fear that uncoiled like a sleeping serpent at the base of my soul. Close, so close now, the faces were more real than any reflection could be. I could see the faint shadow of stubble on my cheek, the little white scar that sleeps above my left eye, a ghost from childhood. I could even see how my pupils in the real world widened with this quiet terror. But these faces were not quite mine. They were worn, older. They wore a map of sorrows I had not yet earned. Their eyes held a knowledge I did not own, a terrible, lucid awareness that made the world gently spin. One shard, resting near my shoe, began to blink a longer story. Dash dash, dot 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 dot, dash dash. My mind read the light as if it were my native tongue. Help me. The words did not echo. They bloomed in the quiet garden of my mind. Help me. But who was the flower and where was the garden? With a slow, careful breath, I rose. The sound of glass sighing under my boots was the only sound in the world. I drew my phone from my pocket, a lifeline to the world I thought I knew, and pointed its lens at the phenomenon. The screen showed only what it was supposed to see. A soft, normal rain, heavy drops of dark water melting into the pavement. Nothing more. The camera saw the dream of the world, while my eyes, my own two eyes, were awake to the truth. Thousands of tiny mirrors, each holding a prisoner who begged for freedom in a language of light and shadow. My own breath came in soft, shallow clouds, misting in the cold air. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain traced a slow finger down my spine. The lullabies of reason faded into silence. Stress does not invent its own language. Altitude does not create artifacts that notice you watching them, and it certainly does not leave behind a field of crystal tears. I bent again, and with the fingers that felt distant and numb, I lifted one of the larger shards. I held it to the faint glow drifting up from the city below. The face inside it moved, but not with me. Its mouth-shaped words, silent and slow, vowels and consonants I could almost taste on my own tongue. But as I watched, something else began to stir in the tiny mirror's depths. In the background, in the darkness behind my reflected self, a shape was moving. Another figure, barely there in the glass ocean. It might have been human. It was reaching, its hands stretching toward my reflection with a terrible, slow grace. The face was a smudge of shadow, but the posture spoke a universal language of profound fear, of a need so urgent it was holy. The glass grew warm in my palm, then hot, a sudden searing kiss. I let it fall with a muffled curse and watched it bloom into a star of even smaller, pieces. They did not stop their message. Even shattered, they continued to blink, to plead. And the message had changed. It had grown. Before dawn comes, before they wake, before the walking begins, my mouth was a desert. They? Who were they? And what would happen when their slumber ended? The city below was a perfect portrait of peace, its windows like closed eyelids. Nothing moved in the winding streets but the ghosts of cats and the lonely drift of a single, late car. But the light in the glass, the frantic, silent pulse, whispered that time was a river, and it was flowing toward a vast and terrible sea. The storm deepened, and the glass rain became a curtain of falling blades. Each sliver that touched my coat, each fragment that chimed against the ground, carried its own story, its own quiet prayer. Hurry, find us. The door is closing. Words of light, building into sentences. Sentences, building into a truth I was not certain my heart could hold. I began to map them. I used my phone, not for its camera, but for its simple notepad, my fingers tapping out the rhythm of the blinks. And the fragments, they seemed to know. They seemed to feel my attention, a soft warmth in the cold night. Their signals grew clearer, more defined, as if grateful for a witness. Slowly, so slowly, a map began to bloom out of the scattered light. A story of another place. There was another Valparaiso, a city of shadows that breathed in the spaces between reflections. A place where souls became lost like echoes when they gazed too long into a mirror during a storm like this one. This rain of glass. It was their hands, reaching through the veil. It was their voices, trying to speak through the only medium that could bridge the gap between their world and the waking one. And their time was a handful of sand. The reflection had been so specific. Before dawn, before the city stirred from its dream, before the feet of the living began their morning walk, stepping across this field of desperate souls. Every footstep, every innocent crunch of glass would be a message torn, a line of communication severed. It would press them deeper into their silent, silvered prison. My hands were shaking as I pieced the map together. The individual fragments were coordinates, places all across the city where the veil between worlds was at its thinnest, places where a soul might, if helped, step back through. But it was a delicate thing, requiring a precise moment, an exact position. And there were dozens of them, scattered like fallen stars across Valparaiso's sleeping hills. The largest shard, the one that had burned my hand, lay near a lamp post whose own light had begun to flicker, as if in sympathy. It pulsed with a new light. It no longer showed just my face. It showed a whole scene. I was looking at myself from behind, kneeling on the ground amid the glittering field, my phone glowing in my hand. But in the world inside the glass, dozens of shadow people surrounded my reflection. They reached, their forms wavering like smoke, their hands pressing against the surface of their world, pushing toward mine with faces of desperate, painful hope. One figure drifted closer to the surface of the mirror, and with a quiet shock that felt like my heart had simply stopped beating, I knew him. It was my father. He had passed from this world 3 years ago, but here he was, younger than I remembered him, more solid than any memory. His mouth moved with a soft, urgent rhythm. I heard no sound, but I understood the words with the perfect, awful clarity of a nightmare. He spoke of a storm 7 years ago, the one that had taken him. He had been here, on these same hills, a meteorologist like me, studying the strange hum in the air. He told me how the first glass rain had begun to fall, how he had looked too deeply, too long, and had fallen through his own reflection. He and the others, they were not ghosts. They were displaced. People caught in the quiet rapids between realities when the riverbanks grew thin. The storms were rare, a convergence that happened only once a decade, perhaps. This night was their only whisper of a chance, but his message was a key turning in a lock, a warning. To help them cross back over, someone from this side would have to take their place. The mirror world demands balance. For every soul that leaves its quiet rooms, another must enter. The choice was mine, and the sun was rising. Before the glass rain whispered its last goodbye and the door closed for another 10 years, my breath became a shallow, ragged thing. The weight of it all settled on my shoulders, heavier than any atmosphere. All around me, the glass rain fell, a crescendo of silent chimes. And now, each shard held a different life. I saw my father, working with others to keep a fragile peace in their silvered city. I saw children who had wandered into a looking glass decades ago, still wearing the faces of youth. I saw lovers, separated by a pane of reality, their hands pressed to the glass. Scientists, explorers, ordinary people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were all looking at me. Below, the city began to breathe. The first lights flickered on in distant windows. The first few souls emerged, beginning their day entirely unaware of the sacred, glittering telegraph they were about to walk across, destroying it with the gentle weight of their ignorance. I looked at my watch. The numbers glowed. 5:23 a.m. Dawn was not an hour away. It was a moment away. The largest fragment pulsed again, brighter, a final desperate heartbeat. In it, my father's face was clear. He mouthed the words that would now become the quiet lullaby of my entire life, whether that life continued here, in the world of solid things, or began anew, in the world of silent light. Save them, son. Save us all. The rain of glass was a song now, a final crystalline chorus of desperation and hope. In their 1,000 faces, I saw not just people, but worlds, whole universes of experience trapped in the silvered spaces between 1 second and the next. I stood in the field of the fallen sky. I felt the choice press down on me, a choice more terrifying than any monster. It was not a choice between good and evil, but between the world you know and the love you cannot bear to leave unanswered. As the first soft finger of dawn touched the hilltop, I knelt one last time among the crystal tears. I placed my palm flat against the largest shard, against my father's world, and I made my choice. The reflection smiled back at me, but it was not my face this time. It was the face of everyone I was about to save. And in that moment, as the veil between the worlds grew thin enough to breathe through, thin enough to become a doorway, I learned the final, quiet truth. Sometimes, the greatest horror is not what you fear will happen to you. It is what you discover you are capable of choosing when faced with an impossible love story. 4. The platform was a stage for a play that had not yet begun. In the thin beam of my light, motes of dust performed a silent, swirling ballet, their movements too graceful, too ordered for a simple draft. The tracks dissolved into a perfect, impenetrable blackness on either side. But ahead, where a solid wall should have been, there was a flaw in the world, A perfect, starless rectangle of an opening, not broken through, but simply absent. My watch glowed. 11:43 p.m. 4 minutes to breathe. The passage beyond was a throat of polished dark, stretching further than any blueprint would allow. The walls were smooth and black, and my light did not simply bounce from them, but skated and warped across their surface, making the tunnel feel as if it were gently breathing around me. My heart had found a new rhythm then, a trapped and steady thing, a metronome counting down to a silence I did not wish to meet. At precisely 11:47, the passage ended. It opened into a space that reason could not hold. A vast, circular chamber, a cathedral of glass whose domed ceiling vanished into a darkness my light could not touch. But it was the walls that stole the air from my lungs. Every inch was covered in them. Mirrors, tall, slender mirrors that stretched me into a whisper of a man. Wide, curved mirrors that bloated my reflection into a grotesque caricature. Small, round mirrors like portholes into other darker seas. An infinite, silent crowd of me. And in the very center, a grand piano, its black lacquer so deep and flawless it seemed not to reflect the light, but to drink it. As I stepped toward it, the reflections began to stir. They were not mimicking me now. In each mirror, a version of me was taking a seat at a piano I could not see. An audience of ghosts, and I was the only one among them. Their hands, all of them, hovered over invisible keys. Then, the music began. It was not born from the piano before me, but from inside me. A single soft note that resonated in my chest, and I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as the fingers of my reflections began to move. They were playing the rhythm of my own blood, the gentle, private waltz of my heartbeat, made audible, made real. The melody was beautiful at first, a tender, swirling tune that made my heart feel light, a flutter of something like joy. But as I stood there, a captive audience to my own life's music, the tempo began to change. The waltz became a frantic dance. My own pulse answered, quickening to match the sound. A sheen of cold sweat breaking on my brow. The figures in the glass played faster, their fingers a pale blur, and my heart became a panicked drum, struggling to keep time with its own terrible song. I tried to tear my eyes away, but the mirrors held me. Each reflection now wore a different face. One wept without sound, tears tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks as his fingers flew. Another grinned, a sharp, manic smile. One, just one, stared out from the glass, looking directly at me, and in its eyes was a depth of knowledge I had never owned. The music grew, layering itself into harmonies that were impossible, 1,000 melodic lines weaving a tapestry of exquisite pain. My chest grew tight, a band of ice and pressure. The taste of copper, sharp and sudden, blossomed on my tongue. The reflections played on, feasting on the sound of my struggle. When I finally found the will to turn, to seek the passage back to the world, the mirrors screamed in protest. The reflection of my turning body began to play a new song. A series of harsh, stabbing, discordant notes, shards of sound, and with each one, a spike of real, physical pain pierced the space behind my ribs. I took a step toward the exit, and a crashing, violent chord erupted from the glass, and the muscle of my heart seized, a stuttering, agonizing contraction that dropped me to my knees. The room filled with the sound of my own ragged breaths, amplified and twisted by the curved glass, until it became a symphony of its own. My reflections had abandoned all melody. They now just hammered at the silence, a chaotic violence that made my pulse leap and falter. My vision began to shrink to a pinpoint of light, but in that tunnel of fading sight, I saw it. A single, quiet truth. One mirror, a small, plain rectangle near the entrance to the passage. It did not show my frantic, tortured reflection. It showed the room as it was, empty, silent. The piano was there, but its lid was closed, and it was draped in a shroud of dust, its bench overturned beside it like a fallen gravestone. The walls were not glass. They were bare, weeping concrete, marked with the same dark stains as the stairwell. The realization was a quiet breath in the storm. There was only one mirror, the one that told the truth. Everything else was a song, a dream, a fever of the eye, clinging to that small, honest rectangle of light. I began to move. I forced my gaze to stay locked on it, a pilgrimage toward the truth. The phantom orchestra still raged, its dissonant chords still sending tremors of pain through my chest, but its notes could no longer find the same purchase in my flesh. With each step I took toward that one true reflection, my own heartbeat began to quiet, to find its old, forgotten rhythm. The passage back was a blur of shaking limbs and shallow breaths, but it felt shorter now. When I finally stumbled onto the platform, the air felt thin and clean. My pulse was a steady, tired beat. My clothes were drenched, and my hands shook with a life of their own. The invitation was still clutched in my fist. I looked down at it. The burgundy ink had shifted. The stamp no longer read Members 01. Now it said Members 1. And beside it, in what looked like the same ink, a single handwritten word, 1. I climbed the stairs and slipped through the worn gap in the gate, emerging into the night air which had never felt so real, so sweet. My phone was alive with light. Dozens of messages, of missed calls, all from the hour I had been below. They were frantic, asking if I was safe. They had seen a news report. A small, strange story about a man found wandering near Chamber Street, disoriented, 3 days ago. A man who claimed he had escaped a club hidden in the earth. A club where mirrors had forced him to play piano with his own heartbeat. My own story, told by a stranger, 3 days too soon. I let the invitation fall from my fingers into a trash bin, and I walked home, under street lights that seemed impossibly bright. That was weeks ago. Now, I do not look at my own reflection for long. I turn away from shop windows, from polished silverware, from the dark screen of my own phone. It is not because I'm afraid of what I will see. It is because sometimes, in the barest flicker in the periphery, I see the ghost of movement, the faint, silent dance of fingers over invisible keys, and for a breath, just a single, stolen breath, I can feel the music begin again inside my ribs. The invitation was for member 1, a performance for a future audience of 2. Story 5. There was a little key made of brass. It rested in the cup of my palm like a sliver of forgotten winter. It was heavier than it should have been, you see, as if its atoms were dreaming of something denser than metal. Professor Hartwell, his hands a flutter of moths, had placed it there. His gaze drifted past my shoulder, to the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, as he spoke in a hush of restricted things, of older, quieter collections. The corridor to the east wing was a long, patient exhalation of shadow, waiting to breathe me in, This exchange at Blackmore University, it had been a whispered promise 6 months ago. A place of deep learning, of ancient stone and shadowed cloisters, holding parchments that time had forgotten elsewhere. The brochures never spoke of the way the shadows here clung to corners long after the light had passed, or how the air in certain halls would fall perfectly still, a hush that was not merely silence, but the absence of sound itself. I had been adrift in this dream for 3 weeks when the professor found me. He said he had been watching. He spoke of my reverence for the old words, my gentle handling of the medieval texts. There was a place, he murmured, a room that had been allowed to sleep for a very long time, not because it was unsafe, but because the things within were as delicate as frost on a window pane. A few are chosen, he breathed, to be its keepers for a little while, and only with the greatest care. The key did not protest. It turned in the old lock with a quiet sigh, a sound of acceptance. The door, which should have wept with rust, instead parted with the sound of a dry throat clearing. A cool breath of air caressed my face, carrying a scent that had no name. It was the fragrance of sleeping paper and quiet soil, with a delicate undercurrent of bruised flowers, a sweetness that made the pit of my stomach fold in on itself. My footsteps did not echo as I crossed into the room. They bloomed. Each soft tread of my shoe on the stone floor seemed to soften and spread, a ripple in a pool of silence, until the sound was no longer my own. The light was a faded memory, pools of honeyed amber that only deepened the darkness between the great shelves. I reached for the wall where the light switch was meant to be, but my fingers met only the cool, uninterrupted skin of the stone. The shelves did not stand, but dreamed of the ceiling, far above the reach of the dim, tired lights. They were filled with books whose spines were turned away from the world, their titles written in alphabets that seemed to quiver at the edge of sight. The characters twisted, like smoke trapped under glass, if you looked too long. The air itself was a presence, a soft, invisible weight that settled upon my skin, a blanket woven from stillness and time. I drifted to the nearest shelf, my hand outstretched with a pilgrim's reverence. The leather of the first book was not cold or dry, but soft against my fingers, like the skin of a living thing. I opened its cover with the care one affords a butterfly's wing, expecting the scent of age, the fragile yellow of ancient paper. But the moment the air touched the page, the book breathed its last. It dissolved, not into dust, but into a fine gray ash that sighed downward, crumbling into nothing before it could even be understood. A soft, frantic drumming began against the cage of my ribs, a trapped bird. I watched, my own breath held captive, as an eternity of thought spiraled down to the floor in soft gray patterns. I took a step back, the air catching in my throat. Surely I had done something wrong. A failure of preservation, a delicate balance undone. But when I reached for the next book, its pages too exhaled into ash, a soft whisper of decay, a gentle surrender to the air. One after another, they returned to dust in my hands, histories of forgotten kings, poems sung to silent gods, philosophies of sleeping worlds, all of it, a quiet cascade of gray. My own hands began to tremble, a fine tremor that traveled up my arms. A film of cool moisture bloomed on my forehead, despite the chill in the air. It was the rational mind that fought for purchase, that whispered of chemical decay, of a hostile environment, of a tragedy of preservation that had claimed them all. But the ash. The ash was not settling into meaningless drifts. I told myself, at first, that it was a trick of the light, the way the soft gray powder gathered in gentle curves, in lines that felt almost intentional. But as more sleeping thoughts crumbled in my hands, the patterns grew clearer. They were not random. They were being drawn by an unseen hand. Letters, spun from the dust of dead words, were flowering on the stone floor. Please, the words shimmered there, written in a script of impossible grace. I could only stare, my vision blurring, my own breathing a harsh counterpoint to the room's deep silence. This was not real. Ash does not weep into words. Books do not die with a touch, leaving behind prayers. Something inside me, not courage, but a quiet, hollow compulsion, urged me on. My hands, which now felt like they belonged to someone else, continued their gentle, terrible work. I moved through the slumbering library, and with each dissolved volume, the carpet of ash deepened, and the words it formed grew more insistent. Don't stop. Keep looking. Find it. The letters formed as I watched, coalescing from the settling gray with a slow, dreamlike precision. My shirt was a cold, damp cloth against my back. The soft beat of my own heart was a drum in the cathedral of my skull. A part of me, the part that still remembered the sunlit world outside, screamed to turn and run, to close the whispering door and forget this place of gentle decay. But something else held me there, a current pulling me deeper into the quiet tide of the shelves. And then I saw it. It slept alone on a high shelf, a small, unassuming volume. It was remarkable only because it remained. While all others had surrendered to the air, it waited, whole and solid. The leather of its binding was the color of deep, dried blood, worn to a soft gleam by the touch of countless hands. There was no title on its spine. My fingers, strangers to me now, trembled as they reached for it. I expected it to dissolve, to sigh into ash like its brethren. Instead, the cover opened smoothly, revealing pages that felt real, that held their form. The first page held only a title, written in a calligraphy of exquisite precision, The Index of Lives Unlived, and beneath it, a single name, Marcus Thorne, my name. The dim, amber light of the room seemed to swim. Little black stars danced at the edge of my vision. A book that had slept here for an age, perhaps for centuries, could not hold my name. And yet, there it was. With a growing, formless dread, I let the pages fall open. They were filled with a story, a life, a history of myself that was not mine. The book told me I had grown up in a small, quiet town called Millbrook. It spoke of my father, a carpenter with sawdust in his hair, and my mother, who taught children their first letters in a sun-drenched classroom. But I knew this was wrong. I knew the steel and glass of the city, the neat columns of my father's ledgers, the clean, antiseptic smell of the hospital where my mother worked as a nurse. The book spoke of friends I had never known, of playgrounds I had never seen, of moments that felt like echoes from someone else's dream. Yet they tugged at me with a strange and gentle familiarity. I tried to close the book. I tried to pull my hands away from this beautiful, terrible lie, but they would not obey. I read on, and as I read, the memories began to bleed. It was like watching ice dissolve in warm water. The solid facts of my own life softened, their edges blurring. I began to remember the scent of cut pine from my father's workshop in Millbrook. I could hear the soft cadence of my mother's voice as she read to me by a fireside that had never existed. But the other memories, my true memories, were still there, shimmering behind the new ones. It was a dizzying double exposure, a ghost life superimposed over my own, and the pressure in my head began to build into a soft, rhythmic throbbing. The very bones of my mind were being gently, lovingly rearranged. While I had been reading, the ash on the floor had stirred. New words had bloomed from the gray carpet. Don't stop now. You're so close. My fingers turned the next page, as if guided by a will that was not my own. With every new paragraph, my own true past grew more distant, more fragile, like a dream half remembered at dawn. The book spun tales of my teenage years, the rough leather of a baseball glove, a first kiss with a girl named Sarah, her name a forgotten melody, beneath an oak tree by a river I had never walked. A graduation day under a summer sky, a whole town's pride wrapping around me like a warm blanket. None of it was true, and yet I could remember the taste of the lemonade at that celebration. I fought to hold on. My apartment, my real parents' faces, the university I had left behind, but they were becoming insubstantial, photographs bleached by a relentless, silent sun. They were fading, and this intricate story, this warm and welcoming fiction, was rushing in to fill the empty spaces. The ash on the floor whispered again, the letters forming and dissolving like smoke in the still, heavy air. Almost finished. Just a little more. You'll understand soon. A tightness grew in my chest. Each breath was a conscious effort, a deliberate pulling of the thick air into my lungs. The book showed me my college years at a small, green campus I had never attended. It gave me professors whose kind, knowing faces I could now see perfectly. It gave me loves I had never felt, triumphs I had never earned, and sorrows I had never known. And with every page, this life, this beautiful lie, became my truth. I felt the wetness on my cheeks and realized, with a distant sort of surprise, that I was weeping. The book was almost finished. 2/3 of its pages had been turned, and I understood with a calm, quiet horror that when the last page was read, the person I had been would be gone completely, erased. I would be Marcus Thorne of Millbrook. I would have lived this life in these pages, and I would never even know that I had once been someone else. The ash bloomed with a new and urgent plea. Please finish. We've been waiting so long. You're the only one who can read it, the only one whose name appears in the index. I tried again to stop, to close the covers, to scream, to shatter the spell that was unmaking me. But my body was no longer mine. My eyes scanned the words, my fingers turned the pages, and my soul drank in this new history, this story that felt more real than reality itself. The book described my decision to come here, to Blackmore. But in its telling, I had not come for manuscripts. I had come for this book. I had been pulled across the sea by dreams that were not dreams, by memories of a life I was not yet living, by a need so deep I had no name for it. The book told me I was the last, in a long, unbroken line. Reader after reader, drawn to this quiet room by that same invisible current. Each had found their name. Each had read their story. And each had been replaced. But I was different. I was the one who was meant to read it all, to the very last word, to close the circle. The ash on the floor was now a frantic, swirling dance, a blizzard of silent gray words. Almost there. Don't stop. Freedom is so close. You can save us all. And then, a sliver of impossible clarity pierced the fog in my mind. The ash. It wasn't the ruin of books. It was the ruin of people, of all the readers who had come before. Their bodies, their minds, their souls, ground down into this soft, gray dust. The messages were not encouragement. They were warnings, the desperate, fading cries of the lost, trying to save me from their fate. But to understand was not to be free. My hand, with its steady, relentless grace, continued to turn the pages. The book described my arrival here, my obsession with this locked wing, my quiet conversations with Professor Hartwell, which now felt like the fulfillment of a destiny written long ago. Only a few pages remained. I could feel my original self slipping away, like sand through my fingers. The memories of Millbrook were no longer memories. They were simply my life. The smell of sawdust was home. My mother's humming was the soundtrack of my childhood. The sun on my face was a real warmth. The ash on the floor settled. It formed one last message, the letters appearing slowly, as if written by a hand that trembled with exhaustion and sorrow. We're sorry. We tried to warn you, but you have to finish it. You have to set us free. I turned the final page. My hand no longer felt like my own. The text here was different. It was not a story. It was a song, an incantation, written in a language that felt older than stone, older than speech. And as I began to read the syllables aloud, my voice a strange, resonant echo in the stillness, the world shifted. The ash on the floor began to rise. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, swirling upward into soft, shimmering columns. The columns took on shape, the shape of people. I could see faces in the swirling gray dust, dozens of them, hundreds. Their eyes were fixed on me, and in their silent gaze was a universe of gratitude and a sorrow so deep it had no end. They were the readers, the souls trapped in the dust of their own forgotten lives. As I spoke, the final alien word of the incantation, the ashen figures began to dissolve, not into dust, but into light. Their faces softened into expressions of perfect peace. They were being released. The air itself shimmered, as if a great, invisible weight was lifting. The entire wing seemed to exhale, a breath it had been holding for centuries. The book in my hands, its purpose served, sighed into ash, its dust joining the now settling carpet on the floor. But this was not destruction. It was completion. The song had been sung. The sleepers had been awakened and set free. The long, hungry dream was over. I stood in the silence that followed. My mind was a quiet house with two residents, two lives, two sets of memories, impossibly intertwined. I was Marcus Thorne of Millbrook, who came here to fulfill a purpose he never understood. And I was someone else, a student whose name was a fading whisper on the edge of my thoughts. The East Wing was clean. It felt lighter. The oppressive, watchful presence was gone, and in its place was a stillness that felt like gratitude. The building itself seemed to thank me. I walked back through the empty shelves, my legs unsteady. My footsteps were just my own now, the simple sound of leather on stone. At the door, I looked back one last time. The shadows were only shadows. The silence was only silence. Whatever had fed here was gone. I locked the door, and the brass key felt warm in my hand as I walked back to Professor Hartwell's office. I couldn't quite remember why I had it. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of questions he knew better than to ask. He simply nodded, as if he understood that some stories are not meant to be told, only lived. I left him and walked into the evening air, carrying the soft weight of 2 lives. I had done something important. I knew it in the way the shadows now seemed to keep a respectful distance. The east wing was free. The lost souls were at peace. But as I climbed the stairs to my small room, a thought bloomed in the quiet garden of my new mind. This was not the end. Somewhere, in another sleeping library, in another locked room, another book was waiting. And in its index, another name was written. And soon, another student would feel that same gentle pull. The thought should have filled me with terror. Instead, a strange, calm curiosity settled over me. I found myself wondering what other secrets slept in the dark corners of Blackmore, and whether I would be ready for them when they woke. The answer, I felt, was already written down. Somewhere in a book I had not yet found. Story 6. The iron veins sleep in the green flesh of the Brazilian wilderness. They are a memory of rust, a long, quiet sigh of steel, half swallowed by the whispering weeds. There is a deep stillness here, a hush that feels older than the trees. It is a place that listens. The sun in the late afternoon drips like thin honey through the canopy, painting long, slow shadows over the abandoned railway, a forgotten line drawn through the heart of Minas' interior. For 3 days, I have walked this line of slumbering steel. My work is to capture the slow, patient dissolving of man's creations back into the earth's dream. For my photography, I seek the beauty in this decay. The people in the last town spoke of these tracks with a quietness in their eyes, a gentle turning away when I asked when the last train had whispered down these rails. My camera, my Nikon, felt like a heavy, foreign stone in my hands. It should be a comfort, this familiar weight, but today, it seemed to sing a low, secret song against my skin, a vibration that made my palm feel damp and strange. I told myself it was only the long walk, the gentle fatigue of the day. The railway was a path to nowhere, stretching in both directions into a soft, green infinity. The rails wore their rust like a dry, powdered blood. The wooden ties, softened by 1,000 rains, were sinking back into the red soil. Green fingers of vine had begun their soft embrace, a patient burial that would, in time, erase all of it. It was a perfect stillness, this gentle war between the iron dream and the green one. I knelt, my knees pressing into the damp earth, to frame a cluster of wild flowers breathing between the tracks. Their soft, white faces were a fragile prayer against the slow death of the metal. Through the small window of my camera, a detail snagged my eye. Far away, the rails seemed to lose their rust, to straighten, as if tended by a careful hand. But that was a thought for a world that wasn't this one. The townspeople had been certain. 30 years since the last train's passing. A soft wind rose, and with it, a scent that did not belong. The ghost of creosote and the memory of coal smoke. I lowered my camera, my brow furrowed. There were no active lines for miles. No reason for such a perfume to linger in this sleeping place. The smell was a key, unlocking a half-forgotten room in my memory. Childhood days at the station, the thrill of a coming journey. But here, it felt like a note played in the wrong key, a soft, slow dissonance. My hands began to sing with a small, quiet tremor as I lifted the camera once more. It was not the day's labor that made them shake. I am strong enough for all my quiet city life in São Paulo. This was a different current, one that seemed to flow from the camera itself. Its metal skin was warm against my palms, warmer than the gentle afternoon could explain. Through the lens, a flicker of movement at the edge of the world. Not the slow dance of the leaves, but something with purpose. I lowered the camera, turning my head to the wall of trees that held the tracks in their green embrace. There was nothing. Only the patient repetition of bark and shadow, the startled flutter of a bird's wing. But the feeling of being seen did not leave. It was a pressure on the back of my neck, like a soft, cool hand. I found myself looking over my shoulder, again and again, as if expecting to see a face in the leaves. There was something about this stretch of track that was different. A deeper silence, a heavier air. I walked on, my boots whispering on the gravel, seeking the quiet compositions where nature's victory was most complete. But the further I walked, the brighter the rails seemed to become, as if I were not walking forward in space, but backward in time. The rust receded. The wooden ties grew stronger, their grain reappearing from beneath a veil of imagined decay. The afternoon light itself began to change, turning to a deep, strange gold it had no right to possess at this hour. My watch confirmed it. 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun should be softening, its light turning to tired amber. But this light had a surreal clarity, making the shadows around me stark and deep, as if carved from black stone. My camera's light meter had gone mad. Its needle danced a frantic, silent waltz, unable to drink in the strange light. It swung from the deepest dark to blinding white, though nothing in the golden air had changed. I tapped the housing, a useless gesture. The needle continued its desperate, silent dance, and then I felt it, a hum, not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, a deep, low thrum that vibrated up from the earth through the soles of my shoes and into my very center. I froze, the camera halfway to my face, and I listened. The sound was a machine's lullaby, a rhythmic pulse. It was, impossibly, the sound of a coming train. I looked down. The rails beneath my feet were still sleeping, still laced with weeds, still dreaming of rust. But the hum grew into a rumble, and with it came a soft, metallic rhythm, the sound of wheels kissing the joints of the rails. Click-clack, click-clack. A broken heartbeat, growing steadily louder, drawing nearer. My own heart began a frantic, panicked beat against my ribs. I stepped from the tracks, a reflex I could not explain. Some sleeping part of me knew to move, even as my eyes told me there was nothing to flee. No headlight blooming in the distance, no plume of smoke against the golden sky. The rumbling deepened, and other sounds now wove themselves into it. The long, slow hiss of steam, the clink of unseen chains, and then the deep, mournful sigh of a locomotive's horn, echoing in the still air. But the tracks remained empty, a silent, sun-drenched ribbon stretching into the trees. My camera began to vibrate in my hands. At first, I thought it was only me, my own body's trembling. But as the sound of the engine swelled, the camera's vibration became a determined thrum, its metal parts resonating with a power I could not see. The long telephoto lens began to swing on its own, a slow, deliberate turn, pointing itself toward the empty tracks like a divining rod, seeking water. I caught it with my other hand, tried to still it, but the force was like a quiet tide, pulling with a strength I could not match. The whole camera twisted in my grip, a live thing fighting to look. A high, mournful whistle unwove the air, so close it felt as if it had been born just above my head. I flinched, ducking my head, a tingling chill tracing its path down my spine. The sound faded into a long, slow echo that clung to the trees long after it should have died. And now there was wind, a hot, dry breath where there had been only stillness. It smelled of hot metal and burned coal. It tugged at my clothes, sent the dry leaves into a swirling dance at my feet. But when I looked, the trees stood serene, their branches unmoved by the phantom gale that blew only down this impossible corridor. The camera was pulling me now. The lens strained toward the tracks, and my arms ached with the effort of holding it back. Its metal body had grown hot, a deep, penetrating heat that was beginning to burn. Through the camera's body, I could hear the faint, frantic whirring of its inner life, as if it were trying to capture 1,000 images of something my eyes were blind to. The sound of the train was a roar now, a symphony of steam and iron that should have been shaking the very ground. I pressed my back against the solid trunk of a tree and stared at the empty space, my mind a quiet battlefield between the scene and the herd. That is when the sparks began to fall. They were born from nothing, tiny jewels of light dancing above the rails. At first, just a few, like blue fireflies in the golden air. But as the invisible presence drew closer, they multiplied into a soft, silent blizzard of spectral fire. They illuminated nothing, yet they shone with a perfect, impossible light. They cascaded around me, kissing my clothes and my skin without heat, leaving behind only a tingling stillness, a feeling that raised every hair on my arms. They seemed drawn to the metal I wore, my watch, the buckle of my belt, and most of all to my camera, which now began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light of its own. I tried to step back, to retreat into the safety of the trees, but the camera held me fast. It was an anchor, mooring me to this spot. The strap cut into the flesh of my shoulder as the machine strained toward the tracks. A cold, quiet dread bloomed in my chest. I would have to choose, let it go, or be pulled into the fire with it. The whistle screamed again, a sound inside my skull now, and with it came the heavy, chuffing breath of a steam engine. Through the curtain of falling blue sparks, I began to see it, a shape made of absence, the shadow of a locomotive, translucent, shimmering like heat rising from pavement, moving along tracks that were both there and not there. The camera was pulling me from my feet. The metal was searing my hands, the smell of my own burning shirt faint beneath the coal smoke. But I could not let it go. This was the photograph that would unravel the world. The terror was a river of ice in my veins, but the artist in me, the witness, saw the terrible, impossible beauty of it. The force grew, a silent, irresistible invitation. I felt my boots slide on the gravel. I was being drawn, slowly, softly, toward the ghost in the machine. The sparks were a tunnel of electric blue fire now, stretching down the tracks into forever. In their light, I saw it more clearly. A great, black steam engine, its cowcatcher like a skeleton's grin. Behind it, a line of passenger cars flickered in and out of sight, their windows like hollow eyes. My mind whispered to me that this was not real, that sleeping railways do not wake, that a train cannot be a thunderous storm and a silent mirage at the same time. But my body knew the truth. The pull was absolute. I felt my feet lift from the earth. The camera was dragging me into the air, My boots scraping against phantom ties my eyes refused to see. In that moment of perfect stillness, suspended between this world and another, I had to decide. I could open my hands and fall back to the earth, to safety. Let my strange, beautiful camera be consumed by the fire, or I could hold on. I could take the journey. I could risk everything to see what lay at the end of this impossible line. The whistle became a single, piercing needle of sound that filled all of space. The phantom train was on me, its translucent form filling my sight, a mountain of shadow and steam. And in that one crystal moment of terror and wonder, I made my choice. I opened my hands. The camera flew from my grasp like a freed bird, its body glowing with a white, consuming heat as it tumbled into the blue, sparkling fire. I watched it vanish into the heart of the storm, just as the invisible engine roared past me. Its passage was a hurricane of superheated air, a deafening threnody of steel on rails that were not there. And then, as suddenly as it had come, there was silence. A silence so deep it had a sound of its own. No bird sang. No insect hummed. The wind held its breath. Even the beating of my own heart seemed to have been erased. I stood alone by the side of the abandoned tracks, shaking in the quiet air, my empty hands still shaped around the memory of my camera. The rails stretched away, rusted and overgrown, just as they had been. The blue sparks were gone. The phantom wind was still. But the world was not the same. Looking down, I saw that the weeds between the ties were pressed flat, two parallel lines written into the earth, the memory of a great weight. On the rust of the rails, there were fresh, bright scratches where the phantom wheels had polished the metal clean. And far in the distance, a small, dark shape rested on the tracks. My camera. Returned from its journey, but not unchanged. I walked toward it, each step a slow, deliberate act. The metal was cool now, but the body was etched with a web of intricate, swirling patterns that were not there before. They were maps of a place I had almost gone, and they seemed to shift and move just at the edge of my vision. The camera still breathes. Its mechanisms move with a soft, supernatural grace, but the images it captures now are different. They show the quiet echoes in an empty room. They find the shadows that have no source. They reveal the soft, hidden seams of the world. I never went back to that stretch of sleeping railway, but sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, when the dark room's red light is the only light in the world, I can hear it. A distant whisper. The phantom train on its eternal journey, along tracks that lie in the space between one breath and the next. And in those moments, as I watch the impossible images bloom on the paper, I know that I did not escape. A part of me is still there. A passenger on a train made of memory, forever documenting a world that lies just behind our own. The whistle still calls to me. It comes in dreams, in the quiet hour just before the dawn. It promises a truth I am too afraid to know. Some journeys, once you have seen the tracks, can never truly end. The camera sits on my desk. Its metal skin is always faintly warm, and the patterns on its surface seem to whisper to each other when I am not looking. It is my reminder that the world is a fragile, haunted dream, and some stories should only ever be whispered. The rest of what I saw, the rest of what I know, is locked away in the photographs I will never show anyone. Pictures of a reality that breathes in the space between a tick of the clock and a beat of the heart. The phantom train still runs, It carries the ones who made a different choice, the ones who held on. Sometimes I close my eyes and I wonder what they see through the windows of those spectral cars. What quiet, impossible landscapes unfold for them. But I will never know. Some mysteries are meant to remain. Some tracks are meant to sleep, undisturbed. At least in this world. sleep. Sleep stories for grown-ups. Stories to fall asleep to. Bedtime story. Bedtime story for grown-ups. Stories for adults. Bedtime stories for adults. The Myth of Atlantis. Soothing Power. Plato Atlantis. Lost City of Atlantis. Minas. Asthma. A calming sleep story. Inflammations. Anxiety. Asthma. Breathing. Asthma sleep. Audiobooks. Bedtime horror stories. Best scary stories. Better sleep. Black screen horror stories. Black screen sleep stories. Dark screen stories. Calming rain sounds. Chilling tales. Compilation. Creepy narration. Creepy rain stories. Creepy sleep experiences. Creepy stories. Creepy stories to sleep to. Black bedtime stories. Deep sleep. Disturbing sleep stories. Disturbing stories. Ghost stories. Guided meditation. Guided sleep meditation. Guided sleep narrations. Guided sleep stories. Guided sleep stories. Guided stories. Haunted sleep stories. Haunted stories. Horror narration. Horror stories. Horror stories to fall asleep to. Horror stories with rain. Horror storytelling with rain. Hypnosis. Insomnia. Let's not eat. Let's not eat. Let's read. Let's read. Let's read. Podcast. Let's read. Podcast. Meditation. Meditation. Mental health. Narrations. Nightmares. Nighttime storytelling. Paranormal activity. Paranormal stories. Podcast. Rain and horror stories. Rain. Rain ambiance horror. Rain. Sounds for sleep. Rainy night scary stories. Real horror stories. Real scary stories. Reddit. Reddit scary true stories. Scary true stories. Relaxing rain stories. Scary bedtime stories. Scary encounters. Scary horror stories. Scary podcast. Scary sleep stories. Scary stories for a rainy night. Scary stories for sleep. Scary stories for sleep with rain sounds. Scary stories for sleeping. Scary stories to sleep to. Scary stories told in the rain. Scary stories told in the rain. Scary stories to tell in the dark. Scary story time. Scary stories, sleep. Sleep aid stories, sleep. The sleep stories for adults. Sleep horror stories, sleep paralysis stories. Sleep paralysis stories, sleep relaxation stories, soothing rain horror. Spirituality. Spooky sleep sounds. Spooky stories. Spooky stories for adults. Stories. Stories from Reddit. Stories for sleep. Subscriber finishes. Terrifying stories. Terrifying true stories. The Storytime. True creepy stories. True crime horror. True crime podcast. True ghost stories. True horror stories. True horror stories. 2025. True horror stories. 2024. True horror stories from Reddit. True scary stories from Reddit. True scary stories. Reddit Let's Not Eat. True scary stories Reddit. Let's Not Eat. True stories. Unexplained encounters. Unsolved mysteries. Scary horror stories. Perfectly paired with soothing rain sounds. Each story is chosen to send shivers down your spine, while the gentle rain creates a calming ambiance to help you relax. Whether you enjoy suspenseful thrillers or unsettling encounters, these tales will spark your imagination and enhance the spooky atmosphere. Let the peaceful rain envelop you, turning your surroundings into a mix of comfort and suspense. The blend of creepy stories and soothing rain offers a unique way to unwind before sleep, perfect for those who like a touch of fright with a relaxation routine. Ideal for nighttime listening, rain sounds. Let the suspenseful tales and tranquil rain lead you into a restful slumber, with dreams as thrilling as the stories you hear. True scary stories in rain and sleep stories. Horror stories to fall asleep.